Hello, folks. Thank you so much for joining. We will start in just a moment to give anyone who may need some extra time to join that chance. All right, once again, welcome and thank you so much for joining for today's webinar. Today, we're going to be going over the 2023 core IMPLAN data. Core data, of course, referring to all of the data created for the United States. We'll be looking at how we've incorporated some structural changes in the economy into this new set of IMPLAN data, which is already available for your use in our application at app.implan.com. My name is Wes Morgan, and I am one of the data developers here at IMPLAN. And today I'm going to be joined by Jenny Montell, our chief economist and the fearless leader of our data team. As always at IMPLAN, we like to keep our webinars interactive by allowing presentees or attendees to pose us questions. So if you do have any, please don't hesitate to ask. Today's presentation will likely take most of our allotted time, so we will be answering questions via the question box feature in the GoToWebinar application. If you would like to ask a question, all you'll need to do is ensure that you have your control panel open by hitting the orange arrow in the upper left portion of the pop-out window. From there, you can type questions into the question box, which is highlighted in orange in the screenshot that's on this slide. Throughout the presentation, members of IMPLAN's educational services team will do their best to answer your questions. Jenny and I will also take some time at the end of the webinar to address a few questions, and we will do our best to answer each one. If you ask a question and don't get an answer via GoToWebinar or Jenny and I, don't worry, we will provide everyone with an outstanding question a response via the email that you use to sign up for this webinar with. So today, we're going to go over just a few things around our core data. We will start with an overview of our data production process and its timeline, and then we will move on to talk about the new BEA Benchmark input-output tables. We won't dive into that too deeply just because we did another webinar on that earlier in the year, which is available for viewing at support.implan.com. Then we'll go over some methodological improvements that we've made to the core data, some economic changes that resulted from incorporation of both new periodically available data and the requisite data that we use every year. And lastly, we're going to touch on our time series data, which is a product that is forthcoming. I'll begin with the data production process overview and what our timeline looks like for producing IMPLAN data each year. So our core data process involves several key steps which help piece together the data that we need from a variety of sources. We use over 90 raw data sets, each of which requires a bit of processing by our team in order to make sure these disparate data work together. Just to give you an idea of some of the types of processing that we do, we've included a brief list. This certainly doesn't cover every type of processing that we complete, but is here just to give you an idea of how we piece together IMPLAN's US data. Among our most important tasks is estimating non-disclosed values. So many of our data sets come with gaps in them for which we need to fill. Non-disclosures in data are usually there due to government sources attempting to shield the identity of businesses in their data sets. So they purposefully introduce missing values. IMPLAN has a variety of methods to plug those holes that have been honed over many, many years that allow us to use fully disclosed data when we are trying to build IMPLAN data. We typically have multiple tiers of methodologies for each number that we need to disclose, meaning that if one method for disclosing a value isn't possible due to just the structure of a given year's data, another one is going to be used. And if that secondary backup method isn't available to be used because of the structure of this year's raw data, a tertiary method is going to be used, and so on. This kind of same idea of backup methodologies is true for all of our processing steps, all the different kinds of processing we do, but it is especially important in the estimation of non-disclosures, which is why I mention it here. We also occasionally need to project lag values in cases where our raw data doesn't match the year of the IMPLAN data that we're creating. And we also need to put data in the IMPLAN industry scheme. None of our raw data comes in the IMPLAN scheme for kind of self-explanatory reasons. So we do need to create one common set of industries into which we can kind of synthesize all of these different data sources. We make all of our data at scale as well. So this means that we need to create data for all geographies that we have in IMPLAN. That includes distributing data from the US level down to states, and states down to counties, and counties down to the zip code. Along those same lines, all of that data needs to roll up. So for example, if you were to go into IMPLAN and combine all of the counties in a state, the state model data needs to match the sum of the county data for every number that we have. We also adjust some of our data for under coverage, and the basic idea behind that is that some of our data sources don't fully cover everything that we need. For example, we use output data for our commercial fishing industry from NOAA, but the Gulf states in that data set don't fully represent all output. Thus, we need to boost the output value for our Gulf states and come up with methods and a bunch of different tactics to do things like that. Another example would be the Census of Employment and Wages, our CEW data, which, for example, does not cover the railroad transportation industry, among others. So we grab data from the Railroad Retirement Board each year to supplement that CEW data. Lastly, we do also need to estimate values where we don't have an annual data source. So for example, supply and demand by commodity each year and domestic trade. Trade, we have our own solution via a gravity model that creates data for us to use in IMPLAN. So this is not, again, this is not a comprehensive list of what we do, but it does cover a large portion of the types of things that we have to do in order to get all of our data sources to meld. Throughout each and every process, we also quality control test our data and manually replicate values to ensure that the programs that we use for all this are working as expected. Quality control checking is extremely important to IMPLAN, and we invest a good amount of time every year across multiple teams to ensure that the data that is coming to you is exactly what we'd expect. So all of this typically takes about 6 months each year from start to finish. Not all of our data releases at the same time, so we have to tackle each data source separately as they become available. Again, this is just a small sampling of the data sets that we use, but to give you an idea, we usually start in April when we get population data, household counts, personal consumption expenditures, private investment, and some lagged employee compensation and proprietor income data. We'll process each of those, run our quality control checks, and then move on to the next month, during which we will get our service sector output values. Generally, this pattern of receiving, processing, and then checking the data kind of happens all the way through the end of September or October, which is September being kind of the last year in which we receive raw data. At that point, we begin preparing data to be loaded into our application. Because our data releases at a specific cadence each year, we also have our steps for processing source data ordered in a very specific sequence. So essentially, we're just trying to maximize timeliness while also still being able to use all the different sets of data that we do incorporate in conjunction with one another. For example, we can't process output data from the BEA until we have all our employment and income values because that output data is lagged and we need something to project it with. Similarly, data that we use from the USDA drops periodically starting in April, but data on the last commodities that we need, which are citrus fruits, don't come out until September. So even though we've got data that started coming out in April, we have to wait all the way until September to be able to incorporate everything all at once. ultimately, we just kind of have to bring everything together with both specific techniques for creating IMPLAN and in a specific order. So as I mentioned, most of the tables that we do use become available each and every year. That being said, we do want to emphasize the distinction between annually used data sets and some periodically used data sets. Those periodic data sets that we get release at a different cadence, and we have to essentially just make those work for longer stretches of time. So for example, a lot of industry data is available every year. If you think about things like output and components of value added in employment, but commodity data like inventory changes and foreign trade of goods, as well as final demand data, also release every year, as do our transfers data. So those flows of money between institutions like government or households. But the same is not true of our periodic data sets. For example, the decennial census is only available every 10 years. That guides our zip code data, land area, and relationships between counties and zip codes, as well as counties to metropolitan statistical areas. Our commuter flows data source updates every 5 years, as does the Census of Agriculture. So one thing that's new for this year's IMPLAN data is the incorporation of the 2022 Census of Agriculture. That is what we use to distribute out all of the data for our agriculture industries. So if those industries are of particular interest to you, a few notes about that can be found in our data release notes at support.implan.com, along with an article on how we utilize that census. Most importantly, the BEA Benchmark Input-Output tables also release every 5 years. And this is one of the biggest updates that was incorporated into IMPLAN's core data for the 2023 year. So I'll now turn things over to Jenny, who is going to talk a little bit more on that topic.
All right, thank you, Wes. We'll share my screen. Wes, can you confirm that you're seeing the presentation view?
Looks perfect.
Awesome. All right, well, thank you for that, Wes, and thank you all for being here. I'm going to start by giving a bit of background on what these benchmark tables are, how we at IMPLAN use them, and how we augment them. So, first of all, just to level set and get everyone on the same page about what input-output tables are. So most of you probably know that IMPLAN is considered an input-output model, or I-O model, and it's because it's based upon these tables that have the same name, input-output tables. And when this kind of research first started with input-output tables and input-output models, they were really focused just on industry to industry interactions. And that's where the name came from. They were looking at what inputs each industry used and the outputs that industries produced. And so they were these input-output tables. And since then, these tables have really been expanded to include all actors in an economy, not just industries, but also what we call institutions, which is basically everything else other than industries. So things like government spending and household spending and tax payments and trade and all these other things. So they've really expanded, and now they present a full accounting of all monetary transactions among industries and institutions in a given year. So in terms of industry interactions, we've got those input purchases we talked about, but also payments to labor and payments to trade. And then when households receive income, how do they spend that income? And we've got information on government spending, investment, trade, taxes, profits, and even more things like social support payments and things like that. And the BEA publishes, Bureau of Economic Analysis, BEA, publishes full detail, or what are known as benchmark, input-output tables every 5 years. And IMPLAN uses these benchmark tables as a base for the subsequent 5 years. So that's what's big and new this year, is that they came out this year and we got to incorporate them into the 2023 IMPLAN data. And what you'll see that I've emphasized here by underlining it, the that we use these as a base. So we don't ever take a number from the I/O table, and you won't see a number from the I/O table right in IMPLAN because these are lagged. These data are lagged relative to the IMPLAN data year that we're using them for. So what happens is we're either using just them on a ratio basis, we're using some ratios from the BEA applied to current IMPLAN values, or we're using some percentages, or we update and project the BEA values. So we're going to talk about some of those in the coming slides. So let's just first talk about what these I/O tables are. So we kind of lump them into certain categories of data they give us. So the first is demand. They give us information on demand for goods and services. So, and we'll break out what types of demands these are. So one type is intermediate demand, also known as intermediate inputs. That's that II right there. That's kind of what we call it. We try to call it that within IMPLAN, but also can be called industry spending patterns. But basically all those terms really just mean what industries spend on their input purchases. And so all the goods and services that industries buy for their annual operations, for producing whatever they produce. Then we've also got factor demand, so otherwise known as value added. So this is the value that each industry makes in payments to labor, taxes, and profits. Okay, this could also be considered each industry's contribution to GDP. Then we've got final demand, and this is the value of purchase of goods and services by everyone other than industries. So by households, government, investment, and demand from abroad. I/O tables also show us the supply of goods and services, the flip side of that point. So we've got byproducts, which is the supply by industry, so the value of goods and services produced by each industry. And this is because industries can produce more than one commodity. They usually have a primary commodity, and then they've got byproducts, things that they produce as a byproduct of producing their primary product. We also have some institutional sales, so goods and services sold by government, and also goods and services that come out of inventory. That if something comes out of inventory, it wasn't produced by industry that year. It was produced in a prior year. So that's why it's considered an institutional sale in this year. It wasn't this year's production. And then we also have, of course, imports, supply of goods and services from outside. There are also some supplemental tables that we use. One is the redefinitions matrix. We have a great support article on the redefinitions matrix if you want to know more about this, but I'll give you one example of it. First, I'll just say it shows the percentage of each industry's activity that is to be reallocated to other industries. And a good example of this would be a hotel that owns and operates a casino within that hotel. Since it's just one establishment, all that activity would be initially considered a hotel activity. However, it's not all hotel activity since it's a casino, and running a casino takes a whole different set of inputs than running a hotel. You probably wouldn't have as many purchases of food and cleaning supplies and bed sheets and all the other things that it takes to run a hotel. So really what we want to do to get a more accurate picture of the activity happening in that economy is to move the portion of sales and employment and labor income and all of that that is associated with the casino and move that to the gambling industry. So that's what the redefinitions matrix is all about. And it gives us a more accurate picture of the activities that are happening in the region and therefore more accurate impacts because the spending patterns for those different activities are certainly quite distinct. Okay, and then we also get commodity margins. We have support articles about margins as well, so I'm not going to go dive deep into that. but it gives us the percent allocation of the purchaser price among the retail, wholesale, transportation, and producing industries. What this really means and what it's really important for is running impacts. When you run an impact that has something to do with a good that is purchased through a retailer, that's when this matters, because we as consumers tend to buy things through retailers. We don't usually go straight to the factory or the manufacturer and buy it. And so all the money that we spend on that good, we give to the retailer. But the retailer doesn't get to keep all of that money, because all of that purchaser price, because they didn't produce that good. They get to keep the retail margin, or sometimes the retail markup, whatever you want to call it, some percentage, say 10 to 15% of that purchaser price. And some will go to the wholesaler to pay for their services. Some go to the transporters for paying for them transporting the good from the factory to the wholesaler and retailer. And then of course the producing industry will get to keep the proportion of the purchaser price that covers their cost of actually manufacturing that good. Okay, so that's kind of I/O tables in a nutshell. Now let's talk about how we use them. We've categorized it into two main ways of how we use these I/O tables. The first is splitting annual raw data into more industry or commodity detail. We use this on several occasions. I've just noted two examples here, one an industry-based detail one and one on commodity-based. So the first is the BEA gives us annually updated values on industry, gross operating surplus, and taxes on production and income, GOS and TOPI. Now, those of you familiar with IMPLAN, you'll probably note that we don't have gross operating surplus surfaced anywhere in IMPLAN, and that's because we split it further into proprietor income and other property income, which is basically corporate profits. And so we split that out even further. But when we get these data from BEA, they come to us in about 100-ish sectors. And we need these data for over 500 sectors in IMPLAN. Now we could, if we wanted to, split out that GOS number and TOPI number into the IMPLAN industry detail using distributors, like using output by industry as a distributor or employment by industry as a distributor. But the problem with that is that we wouldn't get a mix of positive and negatives by industry. If BEA told us that GOS for the farm sector was negative in 1 year, which it can be, and if we use some other distributor, something like output or employment from that year, then that means all the farm sectors would get a portion of that negative GOS, and they'd all get negative. They'd all show negative profits for that year. When really certain crop sectors or animal production sectors might be more prone to having negative GOS than others. And that's why we use the benchmark I/O tables to give us that split out, because the benchmark shows GOS and TOPI for all that industry detail that we need for each of those specific farm sectors. And so that way, using that for a mix, as a distributor, then we can have that mix of positives and negatives across the various farm sectors, for an example. So that's more accurate, and that's why we use that. An example on the commodity side would be our BEA foreign trade of services. The data source we use for that every year just gives us a total of foreign imports of services and foreign exports of services. It doesn't have the commodity detail. Well, the benchmark I/O tables does give us detailed by industry foreign exports and foreign imports of services. And so we can use that to help us break out into more detail the current values that we get from the BEA each year. Okay, the second way we use the benchmark tables is for values for which there is no annual raw data source. Here are a few examples. We've already talked about several of them. Redefinitions, those are just reallocation percentages. So we can just use the same percentages every year for 5 years. That's fine, because we're applying them to current output values by industry. It's just that the reallocation percentage stays the same for 5 years. No big deal. Same with commodity margins. We get updated values every year on the spending on goods. These commodity margins just help us split out how much of that spending goes to the retailer versus wholesaler, transportation sectors, and the producing sector. So we just use those same allocation percentages for the 5 years till the next benchmark comes out. Likewise for byproducts. These are just percentages that tell us which commodities each industry produces and in what allocation, what percentage. So we can just use those for the next 5 years. Okay, then we have industry spending patterns. This is something where there is no other data source for these in such a detailed way with all the detailed industries and commodities that we need. This is our only data source, pretty much only data source for these. I'll mention one other one after this, and you can't really have impact models without knowing what industries spend their money on. So this is really important, and we do actually update these numbers, even though they are percentages that we could use the same percentages for 5 years. We don't, because we get all kinds of fresh new data on an annual basis that allows us, and in fact kind of forces us, to adjust these and update these purchase percentages. So I'm going to talk about that next. Okay, so we update the benchmark industry spending pattern percentages each year in 2 main ways with the help of annual data values for output by industry, value added by industry, final demand for each commodity, and institutional sales of each commodity. So we get new values for all those things every year, and they basically force us / allow us to update industry spending patterns. And I'm going to show you how to do that, or how that happens. First, I'm going to start off just to make sure everyone's on the same page with our output equation, which most of you have seen, and you've definitely seen if you've ever attended an IMPLAN training. And it basically is just a simple algebraic equation that says that industry output, each industry's output, also known as value of production, is the sum of the inputs that it buys, the goods and services it buys, plus its expenditures on labor income, taxes, and anything left over for profits. All those, and all of those sum to value added. Those are components of value added. So industry output is just the sum of those 2 things, the raw inputs plus any labor, taxes, and profits. Okay, and I have highlighted in red, written in red, the output and value added, because we get updated values for those every year. And so if I know output and value added, then I must know this year's total expenditures on an intermediate inputs. This is a simple algebraic equation. So let's just do a super duper simple example. Let's suppose that we got new data that told us that output increased by 10% for a given industry, and value added for that industry stayed the same. So if value added stayed the same and output increased 10%, that must mean that the total expenditures on intermediate inputs increased by 10%. Awesome. Okay, so when we know that, in this case, then each industry's intermediate input values are adjusted proportionately for each commodity. So what that means is if we know that the industry's total intermediate input expenditures increased by 10%, as in my example, then that means that their purchases of each item in that list increased by 10%. So that's what I mean by proportionate. So in this case, we're just, think of the industry spending pattern as an accordion, and we're just stretching it out, making all the numbers bigger, or we're squishing it down, making all the numbers smaller, according to what our new total value for intermediate inputs has to be based on our updated numbers of output for output and value. Okay, so that's on an industry basis, adjusting the commodity purchases proportionately. But then we also have to look at the supply of these commodities and what's available. So here's another equation that total demand has to equal total supply. Now that includes trade. Imports and exports are in there. And so total demand includes industry demand, that's II, plus final demand for commodities, plus exports. Those are all the demanders of our commodities. But that has to equal the supply of commodities in our region, which come from industry supply, institutional supply, and any imports that we made of that commodity. And again, I've highlighted in red all the things that we get annually updated numbers for, all of them except one. So we only have one unknown, and therefore we can solve for this. And again, it's those intermediate inputs, those industry purchases of inputs that there is no annual data source for. But we get to update them annually because we have updates, annual updates on all these other components. So in this case, we're not doing it proportionately for each industry, which is awesome. So each industry's intermediate input values are then adjusted uniquely for each commodity based on annual values for final demand for each commodity and supply for each commodity. So we're really updating these industry spending patterns every single year. Okay, now moving on from that to just talk about how IMPLAN gets its list of industries and how it doesn't match the benchmark industry list and why. There are 3 reasons why, and I'm going to go through all those. So just to tell you, the BEA benchmark has 402 industries in this latest benchmark, while IMPLAN, the new IMPLAN sector scheme, has 528. How does that come about? The first way is that we use previous benchmark I-O tables to split the more aggregate values from the latest benchmark into previously available industry and commodity detail. Now, Wes mentioned that we already have a webinar that we did that was entirely dedicated to the benchmark. So I'm going to refer to you to watch that recording. If you want to know exactly how we do this splitting out, we actually did an example in Excel and everything in that webinar. So I'm not going to repeat that here, but basically we can use old benchmarks that have old spending patterns for more detailed industries that no longer exist in the current benchmark to help break out the current benchmark's more aggregate industry into its former detail. An example of this would be bowling. We still have the bowling industry, even though the benchmark, the current benchmark, no longer has it. But we have a spending pattern for it that's just old, and we update it and bring it along with us. And so you can watch that webinar if you want to see a little bit more how we do that. So that's how we get more detail. We also get more industry detail by building some production functions for industries for which the BEA has never provided production functions or industry spending patterns. The main example here is the electricity sectors. So BEA has always only had one single industry that represents electricity production, distribution, and transmission, all in one sector. And what we have done is built our own industries to break this out into various types of electricity production, like nuclear, fossil fuel, wind, solar, and more. And also to have a separate industry for the transmission and distribution of that electricity. And we have a nice article about how we do that on our support site that Wes mentioned, support.implan.com. You can see more details of how we did that if you would like. And then lastly, we lose some industries due to the loss of NAICS codes for them. So NAICS code, NAICS stands for North American Industry Classification System. And one of our most important employment data sources comes in NAICS codes. And this is the Bureau of Labor Statistics Census of Employment and Wages data, or CEW data. And if we don't have annual employment data for an industry, we can't have that industry in IMPLAN. So and NAICS codes are updated every 5 years as well. And so when we lose a NAICS code, we lose that industry detail. And the benchmark, since it's a little bit older, this current benchmark is based on 2017 NAICS codes. But we now live in a world of 2022 NAICS codes. That's the current NAICS scheme, and that's the current scheme that the BLS CEW data come out in. And so there are some sectors in the benchmark that we have to aggregate. So we don't really lose them, we just lose the detail. They get aggregated. So an example of this are some mining sectors, so gold ore mining and silver ore mining. They were separate in the latest benchmark, but we don't no longer have NAICS codes for those separately. They've been combined into a single sector called gold ore and silver ore mining. And so those have to be combined in the IMPLAN sectoring scheme as well. So another one would be battery. There used to be 2 battery manufacturing industries, and now they've been consolidated into one. Okay, now moving on to some of the fun stuff. I'm going to talk about, just briefly show a few of examples of the benchmark reflecting real world trends. So here we have some information on spending. So there aren't separate sectors for electric vehicle manufacturing versus the traditional gasoline engine, ICE vehicle manufacturing, but you can get a sense of what types of vehicles are being manufactured by looking at the spending pattern of the automobile and light duty motor vehicle manufacturing industry. And here we just took a look at this industry's spending on gas engines and engine parts versus batteries from the last benchmark, the previous benchmark to the current benchmark. And you can see that the spending on gasoline engines has fallen quite significantly, and the spending on batteries has gone up a little bit, not a ton, but it has gone up. So just neat to see the benchmark reflecting real world trends. Another one, just the digitization of industry. The spending by all industries on these computer commodities here has gone up 23% between the benchmarks, and homing in on one specific industry, the broadcast and wireless communications equipment manufacturing industry. We focused on that one because that is the industry that includes smartphones. And you can see that its spending on computer related device or commodities has gone up by over 300%. So really reflecting that our phones have become full-on computers at this point. And lastly, just also looking at digitization a little bit, looking at industry spending on paper as a percentage of their total industry spending, it fell 30% between the benchmarks, which jives with this whole trend. Sorry, I said that was lastly. I had one more. Total industry spending on insurance as a percentage of total industry spending increased 9% between benchmarks. And this really reflects what we hear anecdotally and what we've just seen with insurance costs really going up because of the increased frequency and intensity of storms and other climate related events, and also just the value of property going up. So value of homes and cars has really increased, and so therefore so has the cost of insurance. So that's something that's reflected in the benchmarks. Now moving on from benchmarks, just briefly want to mention that we also every year we usually have 1 or 2 methodological improvements or changes that are incorporated into the IMPLAN data. And so I'll just mention, we didn't have a lot this year, but I want to highlight one is that we have improved farm sector employment estimates. And the idea with this is, let me just give you a little context and background. Those CEW data that we mentioned exclude most agriculture workers on small farms. This is one of the things Wes mentioned, where we have to account for under coverage. So CEW data cover between 90 and 95% of farm workers, not all of them. So we can't just use the CEW data or we'd be undercounted. Well, the BEA has some tables called the Regional Economic Accounts data, and they do have full coverage They cover all employees for all industries, which is great. However, their data are lagged a year relative to the IMPLAN data year, and they just have a single aggregate farm sector. They don't have the 14 farm sectors that we have at IMPLAN. So what we had been doing was relying on these BEA Benchmark I-O tables and using the employment per output by farm sector reflected in the benchmark and applying that to our current values of output. The problem with this is that output for the farm sectors fluctuates a lot. In a lot of ways, it's just due to the price of their commodities that they're selling fluctuating a lot. So the output for these industries can fluctuate even when the physical production doesn't actually increase or fluctuate. Because remember, output is the value of production. So even if the physical production stayed the same, the output value could increase if the price of that commodity increased. And so when we have employment based on output, that means we're getting employment values that fluctuate a lot and really can and sometimes just be reflecting price changes where there really shouldn't be increases or decreases in employment levels because physical production hasn't increased or decreased. So that was a problem. So we made two improvements. One is to apply inflators to those benchmark ratios before we use them. So that will hopefully take some of that, those price effects out, which is great, to try to get employment estimates that are more related to changes in physical production than to changes in commodity prices. And then we do end up controlling, now we are controlling these sector-specific employment estimates, first estimates, to a projected BEA REA farm total employment value. So we're now incorporating that BEA REA number, even though it's aggregate and lagged. We're going to first project it using growth factors from CEW, and then we're just controlling our more detailed, sector detailed values to that farm total from REA. But the great thing with that is just it allows us to incorporate more current data on the output of farms than just the current output values that we have. Oh, sorry, more recent data on employment. So that's really great. Okay, now I'm going to hand it back to Wes because he's going to showcase some of the economic changes that are reflected in the new IMPLAN data that aren't specifically related to the benchmark or our methodological changes and are just related to changes in the economy. Okay, Wes, I think you should have control now.
All right, perfect. All right, are you able to see my screen okay?
Yes, it looks great.
Excellent. Okay, so thank you so much. Yeah, so like Jenny mentioned, I'm just going to highlight a few of those other notable changes in the economy that you can track as of the 2023 data year. Again, these aren't specifically related to new BEA benchmark tables. These are just kind of examples of changes that happen each year due to implementation of all of our source data. So those periodic and those annual data sources. So firstly, we just wanted to take a look at the percent change in GDP between the prior year and 2023. Of note is that every single state experienced an increase in real GDP. So we typically see consistent growth year over year in IMPLAN data, and this data set is certainly no exception. The states that experienced the highest amount of growth here were Florida, Montana, Nebraska, and Arizona, with Nevada growing the most at 7.33%. Nevada did gain a few new industries, but it also sustained many high growth industries like battery manufacturing and support activities for oil and gas operations. Those kind of lend to explaining that growth. Taking a look at GDP growth also got us thinking about those times where we didn't see kind of consistent growth in all cases, such as during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we also thought it might be nice to compare some figures in 2019, which is pre-pandemic, to the 2023 data. So looking at household spending between those years, we do see growth in that field as well. After adjusting for inflation, spending per household only remains below 2019 levels for our highest household group, which are those households making greater than $200,000 annually. Overall, every other household does see a little bit of growth here. Real household spending did continue to grow, but not quite at the same pace as in prior years. So between 2022 and 2023, real spending grew by about 6.2%, whereas in the prior 2 years, we saw growth of just around 10 or 12%. Another topical figure that we thought was interesting was looking at the breakdown of other property income per output to get at corporate profits. That OPI is pretty close to synonymous with corporate profits. So as you can see, between 2019 and 2023, an industry-wide measure of OPI per output shows slow but steady growth of corporate profits. In the retail industries, however, we do see profits that are particularly elevated from where they were in 2019. That does jive with a lot of public discourse that's available, though there is some evidence out there suggesting that profits retailers are making have started to come down in 2024. So we'll be very interested to see whether or not that is indeed the case, especially as we move towards creating the 2024 IMPLAN core data, which has already begun. As for employment, we did see really incredible growth in the data processing, hosting, and related services industry. The employment value in the United States for this industry total was just shy of doubling from 1 year to the next. By contrast, the industry that lost the most employment was our videotape and disc rental industry, which is a little sad, but not too surprising. So for this industry, for the data processing, hosting, and related services industry, California was most responsible for growth in terms of just flat number. Other leaders, states in that were Texas, Florida, New York, and Illinois. Interestingly, all states did grow for this industry, and the top growth states by percent, so rather than looking at a flat number here, but by percent of growth in employment in this industry, those top states were District of Columbia, Alaska, South Dakota, Wyoming, and Indiana. Okay, so as I've just explored briefly, IMPLAN data does change year over year, every year, due to incorporation of data sets that release both annually and periodically. In order to better look at trends or more wide-reaching changes in our economy, we do also produce a set of time series data after each release of the benchmark input-output tables. So that's every 5 years, we'll produce time series data. Like Jenny mentioned earlier, our industry scheme changes because of this data. So we want to give users the chance to be able to use multiple years of IMPLAN data in one consistent format. So in this case, we want to be able to produce data going all the way back to 2001 in our new 528 industry scheme. So to do that, we create a time series data set. What our time series does is essentially re-estimate all of IMPLAN's prior data sets so that they are in one scheme. So not only does this put everything in one consistent industry set, but it also gives us the chance to use improved raw data sources. So if a data set has been revised by its creator, we get to incorporate all of those revisions that have occurred in the year since. Data that we normally have to use in a lagged form, which we then do projecting on for our annual processes, we can use that data without projections because those prior year data sets are all now out. We also get the chance to incorporate any methodological improvements that we make during our annual data production process. So like that improvement to the farm industries that Jenny went through, that will be incorporated into our upcoming time series data set for all of our years. Occasionally we do get, include those improvements, and that's really what makes these data sets kind of have maximum comparability to each other, within a single time series data set. I will say IMPLAN data is largely comparable year over year. We don't make too many tweaks or changes every single year, but this is the set that we produce where one is going to be able to look at trends and changes in the most strict sense. So, that's really, and if you're looking for maximum comparability year over year, you want to be able to use a time series set rather than kind of annual data. Now that the core data is finished and available, our newest iteration of time series data is in production, so that is underway. And we are going to make this data for all geographies other than zip codes and congressional districts. And we expect to be done sometime in 2025. We can't really promise any dates more specific than that at this time. We will likely do another webinar on the time series data once it's complete. But if you are curious about it, the prior iteration of time series data is available, and there are plenty of resources on it now. So time series data is made available in Data Library, which is our data research section of our application. Within Data Library, you can view custom and pre-made dashboards, create data visualizations, download all our data, and then we also have guides and videos that will help get you started available for you to peruse. In Data Library, you have access to any of the data that can be found within any IMPLAN model, as well as some additional data sets like our trade data and our fully disclosed census of employment and wages. If you don't have access to Data Library, please feel free to reach out to your customer success manager. With your customer success manager, you can discuss about adding Data Library onto your current package. And if you don't know who your customer success manager is, you can also always reach out to us at support@implan.com. Okay, with that, we'll now turn to some of the questions that we have received and begin answering them. If you do have a question that you'd like to ask at this time, please feel free to type it into the question box of the GoToWebinar application. Again, definitely don't worry if we don't get to your question now, as we'll be able to make sure everyone gets an answer. We'll follow up via email. And then additionally, for this webinar in particular, we are going to be doing a second iteration that focuses kind of primarily on customer questions. So if you do think of anything that you'd like to know later on, please look out for our January webinar registration email and feel free to submit your questions there. Also keep an eye out for our other future webinars, such as the overview of our Canadian data and some of the improvements made there that is going to be coming out very soon. So with that, we will go ahead and begin. I am going to start looking at some of the questions.
Wes, I can hop into one if you'd like.
Perfect, absolutely.
Okay, there's someone asking about the employment multipliers for grain farming and how they changed, and wondering if we have any insight on how much of the change was due to the change in our methodology about farm employment versus the update of the benchmark tables. And I just wanted to mention a couple other things. In addition to a change in methodology and a new benchmark, we also got the new census of agriculture. So don't forget that. That was also incorporated. And so I can't answer that without doing a little more research, but if you would please let us know specifically which region you're talking about. So I don't even know your geography that you're talking about. Give us the region and we can look into that a little more and see if we can narrow it down onto what was having the biggest influence there. We're happy to do that for you and get back to you later on that one. We also had a question about does farm sector include fish farming? And the short answer to that was yes. And we have bridges from from NAICS codes to IMPLAN sectors with all the details of all the activities that are in each IMPLAN sector. And you can access that through the app and also on our support site. So feel free to look for that bridge and you'll get all the details of the types of fishing and all the other things that are in that IMPLAN sector 14, all other animal production.
Great. Kind of similarly along those lines, I see a question saying, also focusing on fishery, is it possible to see the split of commercial fishery into different categories? Yeah, so it's not possible using our exact industry data, but there are a couple of different ways one could go about splitting an in-plan industry into further detail. The first and primary way that we would probably recommend is exactly what Jenny was talking about, is using census of employment and wages to look at all the different NAICS that comprise an industry, and then turn those into ratios which you can use up against your in-plan data. Another, for the fishery industry, the commercial fishing industry in particular, another source that you might want to look into is the NOAA data that we use. So this is available on our site. The data that we use is referenced on our site, but if you just type in the NOAA commercial fish landings data, that will pull up pages where you can see basically total catch by different fish species. So one could certainly turn that into percentages and apply those splits to your in-plan industry as well. In general, if you're looking to split an in-plan industry out into a little bit more detail, there are lots of different kinds of ways you can do that. Again, CEW is our typical go-to recommendation, but our education services team and our customer success manager is always available to help field those kind of questions, and they can be reached at support@implan.com. So for specific studies, that is kind of where we would tend to send people, support@implan.com.
Thank you so much, Wes. I have a question on how much has the recent suspension of key REA tables by BEA impacted your methodologies? This is a relatively big deal for us, and it didn't impact anything related to our current data release. We had all the data we needed. This is only going to affect us going forward, and we've already done some research into alternative methodologies. So it's not going to impact what data points we have in the app and the data that we produce. It's just going to impact how we get those numbers, but we already have ideas and some plans sketched out about how we're going to do that. Wes has done more of that research, so I don't know if he wants to say anything else at this moment, but I also want to say that we're going to have a Q&A style, question and answer style webinar next month with Wes and I related to the data. And so at that point, what we might do is present a little bit of our plan there, or be able to answer that question a little more fully then, because it's something we've barely begun to look into. But Wes, I don't know if you want to add anything at this point about that.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add other than what you've said. I mean, essentially, some of the bigger tables that have dropped are really around getting our proprietor estimates, our number of proprietors. Luckily, proprietor income is still going to be provided. So that's kind of the trickier figure to estimate. But we have, like Jenny mentioned, we've begun looking into kind of trying to develop our own way to do that. And more details we'll have to give you later once we're able to kind of be able to get into the weeds and figure out exactly how we're going to do that.
We'll definitely be open book about it once we get there. We're still working on other data products at the moment and not worried about 2024 IMPLAN data just yet, but we will be soon.
Yep. Okay, I think probably have time for one or two more questions. So let's see, I see, will the NAICS bridge be updated for our 528 sector scheme? Yes, it will. And that is actually already available. We've had that on our support site under our downloadable section. If you would like to kind of be directed towards that, we can definitely get you the correct link.
Great. I saw one question about wanting to know the specific ratios we used for splitting out BEA industries. Did you already address that one?
I did not. Nope.
Okay, how we split those, and I referred the listener to our webinar that we devoted specifically to the BEA benchmark, because there we really go into detail about exactly how that is done. So please watch that
And
in the
by
chat.
extension, I do see one other question that's kind of the opposite of that question, is that you can see the IMPLAN sectoral scheme is more disaggregated than the benchmark. So how could you aggregate the table? For example, go back to 402. We could definitely supply some bridges on exactly how to do that. Which sectors you would need to add up in order to get your industry scheme in that format, and that should generally be a lot easier than disaggregating.
Indeed.
So we'll reach out with information on that as in our reply after this.
Well, thank you all so much for attending. Thank you, Wes, for presenting with me.
Absolutely. Likewise, we appreciate all of your attendance here today. And please, once again, don't hesitate to reach out if we can help with anything. Support@implan.com. Have a great day, everyone.